A different, fragmented, and almost silent war is underway, one that could change the economic and geopolitical fate of all of Europe. Putin wants to recreate the Tsarist empire, and Trump's return could bring new upheaval to the old continent. Perhaps we are close to the end, or perhaps Europe is approaching the beginning of a new era. Today, we seek to understand the current state of the war in Ukraine in early 2025 and how the situation could change after Trump's election. The outcome of this war directly affects our future and that of Europe. Its result will have a significant impact on all European countries. The situation could become even more complicated with Trump's threat to withdraw the United States from NATO, making it crucial to understand what is truly happening in Ukraine. We will revisit the entire history of the war to examine possible future scenarios. How the war began. The current invasion of Ukraine began on February 24, 2022. However, the conflict actually started more than 10 years earlier at the end of 2013. At that time, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych suspended several trade agreements with the European Union, stating that he preferred to strengthen economic ties with Russia. As negotiations with Russia progressed, the Ukrainian public, mostly against these agreements, felt they were too one-sided in Moscow's favor. Rather than aligning with Russia, the Ukrainian people believed Yanukovych was handing control of the country to them. By 2013, Yanukovych was already widely unpopular due to corruption scandals and authoritarian actions against political opponents, often involving violence. As a result, protests escalated into what became known as the Maidan Revolution. In early 2014, Yanukovych was removed from office and fled to Russia to avoid prosecution. His downfall sparked the first conflict in the Crimean Peninsula. Yanukovych's supporters launched an uprising, officially calling for their territory to be annexed by Russia. However, it soon became clear that much of the rebels' operations were heavily supported by the Russian military. The Putin government launched an attack on foreign territory without formally declaring it, quickly taking control of Crimea and officially annexing it via a referendum. The way events unfolded led many countries to impose initial economic sanctions on Russia and members of its government. The reason was that Russia's military involvement in this manner violated international law. However, to go beyond a purely Western perspective, one must acknowledge that rebellions among the Russian-speaking community in Ukraine were real, even if it remains unclear whether the majority of locals truly supported them. Shortly after, in 2014, uprisings also erupted in the Donbas provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk. The rebels, armed by Russia, seized significant portions of the territory, declaring two autonomous republics intending to join the Russian Federation. The conflict in Donbas reached a stalemate, and by late 2014, Ukraine and the rebels signed a ceasefire under the Minsk agreements. However, clashes between Ukrainian forces and rebels never entirely ceased, persisting sporadically. As a result, the situation remained frozen. This, however, strengthened the Ukrainian public's desire to move closer to the West. By 2017, the Ukrainian government formally announced its intent to join NATO, the US-led military alliance, and also pivoted its economy toward the European Union. Meanwhile, trade between Ukraine and Russia collapsed. Many countries refused to recognize Crimea's annexation and maintain sanctions against Russia. For Putin's government, this was a negative outcome. While it had gained Crimea, it also suffered sanctions and lost its influence over Ukraine, which now saw Russia as a hostile force. By late 2020, Ukraine officially began the process of joining NATO. Russia responded in 2021 by massing troops along the border and demanding that Ukraine's NATO membership be halted. Putin also requested a formal agreement preventing Ukraine from ever joining NATO. However, both NATO and Ukraine rejected this demand. Thus, the fire that started in 2014 turned into a full-scale blaze in 2022. The full-scale war began in 2022 when Putin officially recognized the two Donbas republics, initiating their annexation into Russia. He launched what he called a special military operation, sending Russian troops into Donbas. The official reason was to defend Donbas from Ukraine, but Putin's primary objective was his own reputation. He wanted to demonstrate that Russia remained a global superpower capable of challenging the US and NATO, positioning himself as a leader for all anti-American forces, much like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Russian government expected an easy victory, believing it could capture Kyiv with little resistance. This would have shown the world that challenging NATO was easier than perceived. However, this assumption turned out to be completely wrong. After an initial rapid Russian advance toward Kyiv, Ukrainian forces counterattacked fiercely. Contrary to Putin's expectations, Ukrainian civilians, many of whom were conscripted due to the emergency, did not surrender but were willing to fight. This resistance surprised the Russian leadership. Ukrainian forces soon pushed Russian troops away from Kyiv, reclaiming most of the country's northeast. The Russians retained control over the southeastern regions, including Donbass and Crimea. Despite Russia's superior military equipment, Ukraine's ability to resist was largely thanks to extensive Western military and financial aid, amounting to over $100 billion between 2022 and 2024, $75 billion from the US and $40 billion from Europe. As a result, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. By early 2025, the war had become a war of attrition, with continuous small territorial gains but no major strategic victories, much like the trench warfare of World War I, the Russian economy and its challenges. Despite facing severe sanctions, the Russian economy has managed to endure, at least for now. Its vast natural resources, including oil, gas, and metals, provide a strategic advantage, while its extensive agricultural production ensures food security. These factors make Russia one of the few countries capable of withstanding international isolation. However, this resilience does not mean the economy is thriving. Sanctions have severed major trade and financial ties, significantly weakening Russia's economic foundation. While the country remains capable of producing weapons and sustaining its population, the overall economic picture is more fragile than GDP figures suggest. At first glance, Russia's economy appears to have weathered the storm, with GDP growth recorded in both 2022 and 2024, and only a mild decline in 2023. However, these figures mask deeper economic struggles that become evident upon closer inspection. The short-term effects of sanctions. Between 2022 and 2023, despite the increasing weight of sanctions, Russia's gas and oil revenues surged. Given that the energy sector accounts for over 15% of Russia's GDP, this boost played a critical role in stabilizing the economy. Ironically, the initial sanctions backfired. European companies were barred from signing new contracts for Russian gas and oil, but existing agreements remained valid until their expiration. Meanwhile, panic in the market led to soaring energy prices, which benefited Russia immensely. European nations, bound by their contractual obligations, continued purchasing Russian energy at these inflated rates. Instead of crushing the Russian economy, the sanctions initially strengthened it, leading to a temporary economic boost in the early years of the war. The long-term consequences of sanctions. By 2024, the economic landscape began to shift. With most contracts expiring, Europe had largely moved away from Russian energy. However, instead of facing economic collapse, Russia managed to adapt. In fact, import revenues rose by 26% compared to 2023. This resilience stems from Russia's strategic realignment of its energy exports. As European nations diversified their energy sources, Russia redirected its gas and oil sales to alternative buyers, most notably China. The Chinese market, with its massive industrial sector, is the world's largest consumer of both oil and gas, making it an ideal substitute for lost European customers. This shift has been crucial for Russia, particularly because its energy sector is heavily state-controlled. Over the years, Putin's government has nationalized key oil and gas companies, ensuring that their revenues flow directly into state coffers. These funds, in turn, fuel Russia's war effort, financing military production and government subsidies aimed at maintaining economic stability. Nevertheless, beneath the surface, cracks are forming. Government intervention in the economy has reached extreme levels, with substantial subsidies propping up businesses and military production. Many civilian industries have been repurposed to manufacture arms, largely financed through energy revenues. This dependency makes Russia vulnerable. Any significant drop in oil and gas revenues could have devastating consequences for its economy. Ukraine's economic struggles. While Russia faces long-term economic challenges, Ukraine has suffered immediate devastation. As the war unfolds on its territory, the damage to businesses and infrastructure has been catastrophic. Between 2022 and 2024, total losses reached an estimated $400 billion, while the country's GDP plummeted by 28.8% in 2022 alone. Compounding Ukraine's difficulties is its demographic disadvantage. With a smaller population than Russia, the demand for soldiers places a significant strain on the civilian workforce. Yet, despite these obstacles, Ukraine's economy has demonstrated remarkable resilience. By 2023, GDP growth rebounded by 5.3%, a sign of partial recovery, though far from making up for previous losses. However, the war has driven millions of Ukrainians into extreme poverty. In 2021, just 5.5% of the population lived in absolute poverty, meaning they struggled to cover essential expenses. By 2022, this figure had soared to 24.2%. With most government resources allocated to defense, providing economic relief to citizens has been an immense challenge. Ukraine's military expenditures further highlight the strain on its economy. In 2023, the country spent approximately 36.7% of its GDP on defense, a stark contrast to Russia's official military spending of 5.9%. In absolute terms, Ukraine allocated $62.1 billion to military efforts, roughly half of Russia's $126.5 billion. The only reason Ukraine remains competitive on the battlefield is due to financial and military aid from Western nations, particularly the United States and European Union. The impact of war on Ukrainian trade. Another key factor affecting Ukraine's economy is its role in global agricultural exports. As one of the world's major grain suppliers, disruptions to Ukraine's trade routes have had far-reaching consequences. Any interruption in exports risks triggering food crises, particularly in low-income countries. Initially, Russia allowed Ukrainian agricultural products to pass through the Black Sea, ensuring that global food markets remained stable. However, by 2023, this agreement had been revoked, forcing Ukraine to take military action to regain control of vital maritime routes. This development further strained the country's economy, adding new layers of uncertainty. The future of Ukraine's economy. The fundamental challenges facing Ukraine's economy are threefold. Widespread destruction. The war has devastated businesses and infrastructure, requiring massive reconstruction efforts. Manpower shortages. The war effort diverts a large portion of the population away from civilian economic activities. Limited resources. Compared to Russia, Ukraine has fewer financial reserves and is more reliant on foreign aid. Ultimately, the fate of Ukraine's economy is tied to external support. Continued aid from Western nations remains essential to sustaining both its military operations and economic stability. As long as international assistance flows, Ukraine can endure the war. But if that aid diminishes, its ability to resist will be significantly weakened. Donald Trump's recent statements on the Ukraine war have sent shockwaves across the world. As the former and possibly future president of the United States, his words carry weight. But what if Trump actually follows through on his promises? What are the possible scenarios for the war, and how will they impact Europe and the rest of the world? Let's break it all down. Scenario 1. The U.S. withdraws support for Ukraine. One of Trump's most controversial assertions is the idea of ending U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine. If this happens, Ukraine would face an immediate crisis. The Ukrainian military, heavily depends on Western support, not just for weapons, but also for intelligence and logistics. Without American aid, Ukraine's ability to defend itself could be severely compromised. But the consequences wouldn't end there. European nations, already strained from supporting Ukraine, would need to fill the gap. This could lead to internal divisions within the European Union, as not all member states share the same stance on the war. Economic impact on Europe and the world. The economic consequences could be devastating. A weakened Ukraine would mean further instability in Eastern Europe, driving up energy prices as supply chains are disrupted. Remember when gas prices skyrocketed at the start of the war? That could happen again, only worse. The global food supply would also take a hit. Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters. Any disruption to its agricultural output could lead to food shortages, particularly in low-income countries. Scenario 2. Trump pushes for a peace deal. Trump has claimed he could negotiate an end to the war within 24 hours. But what would that peace deal look like? A quick agreement might require Ukraine to make major concessions, possibly ceding territory to Russia. This would undoubtedly be controversial and could lead to long-term resentment and unrest. For the international community, a deal seen as favorable to Russia could weaken trust in Western alliances. NATO's unity could suffer as some members push back against perceived appeasement. Public opinion would be split, both in the US and abroad. Trump's supporters might praise his approach as pragmatic and cost-saving, while critics would argue it abandons democratic values and emboldens authoritarian regimes. In Europe, the response could be even more intense. Eastern European countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which feel directly threatened by Russia, would likely see mass protests and calls for increased military preparedness. Scenario 3. Escalation and global conflict. There's also the risk that Trump's approach, whether through withdrawal of support or pushing a hasty peace, could embolden Russia. If Putin sees the West divided and Ukraine weakened, he might escalate military actions. This could draw NATO into direct conflict, with catastrophic global consequences. Energy markets would collapse, supply chains would freeze, and millions could be displaced. What's next? So, is Trump bluffing? Or could his words shape the course of history? One thing is certain, his statements have already changed the conversation. The world watches and waits, hoping for peace but preparing for the worst. What do you think? Could Trump's approach end the war, or would it lead to greater chaos? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into global issues.